Here in Plugin 101, we've been discussing events and event listeners. We just finished our coverage on the different events that we can listen for in Sublime Text 3. Now, of course, when the next version of Sublime becomes available, there's going to be more events that we can listen for, and we're going to have another lesson covering all of the juicy goodness in those ones. But while we're waiting for those releases to become publicly available, I thought it'd be a good idea for us to go through some example event listeners to show what you could actually use these for in a real world situation, and also underscore the difference between event listeners and view event listeners, because there is a little bit of subtlety there and what makes one perhaps better than the other that will become more clear when we see some examples. So I should probably stop yammering here and let's get into it. Hello, fellow Sublime Pix fanatics. Odette Nerd here. Welcome back to Plugin 101, the video series teaching you how to become a package and plugin author in Sublime Text. Now, recently in Plugin 101, we've been discussing events and event listeners. In the last couple of lessons, we've covered all of the events that are currently available to us in Sublime Text 3. Now, I was asked recently the question, is Sublime Text dead? Is all development finished? And the answer to that question is no, it's not. There's a version of Sublime that's currently in development. When it's released, it's going to have even more events than the ones we've already covered. So if you haven't already done so, use the buttons down below to subscribe and share, ring the bell notification icon, and you will get notified when the lessons on those new events come out when that version of Sublime Text becomes available. Until then, though, today's lesson is going to be on covering some actual real world event examples that we might actually want to use. And I use finger quotes here because while these are examples of things you might actually want to do in a real plugin, they're small, simplistic examples that show how powerful these events are, how you might actually listen for one. But of course, in a more real world example, there would be more code fleshing things out behind the scenes. So these definitely show things that can be done, but you might need a little bit more work. And as a part of this, we're going to be using not only event listeners, but view event listeners. Now, remember, the difference between an event listener and a view event listener is very minuscule. Primarily, the things that set these things apart are view event listeners are associated per view, so there's more than one instance of them created, one for every view to which they apply, and they have a self.view property, whereas event listeners are more global, if you will. Only one instance is ever created, and all events trigger inside of it. So apart from that, and the fact that there's a couple of events that won't trigger in a view event listener because they don't apply to views, everything about them is the same. So for that reason, in all the previous examples in the lesson, just for simplicity's sake, we've been using event listeners. Today, we're going to see not only some examples of event listeners, view event listeners rather, but why you would choose a view event listener in the first place. Going over to our sample file, I have 4 different event listeners in here for us to go over, 2 event listeners and 2 view event listeners. So go ahead and go down to this first one. Now, Sublime Text is a text editor. Unsurprising, it says that right in the name. And by default, the file type of newly created files is plain text until you save that file to disk with the name or extension that tells Sublime that it should be a different type of file, or you use one of the commands from the command palette or the menu to swap the syntax to something else if you want to have language support before you commit the file to disk for the first time. Now, there's not actually a setting to swap that default syntax for something else, but what if you wanted to do that? What if you're a Python author or a web developer and you primarily want to have a different type of file other than plain text? Because you can always make a file plain text by saving it as a text file. There's no setting to do that, but it's very easy for us to do. And this event listener is an example of how to do that. Now, this is the default file type listener. Remember, the name of the listener does not matter. Sublime is going to create instances of this class automatically as it needs them. So this is purely for our information. And in all of these, I've given them names that say what they do. And I'm following the convention of having listener in the name because that makes it easier to find in the symbol list if you're browsing around inside of your package. Now, this is an event listener and not a view event listener. And the reason for that is we're listening for the on new event, and the on new event does not raise inside of a view event listener. So one reason you might want to choose one over the other is if the event you actually want to listen for actually exists inside of that particular event listener. Now, the on new event gets raised every time a new view is created, that is every time a new tab is added to a window, and it gets told the actual tab that was created. And this is a very simple 2-line bit of code. We ask the view for its default syntax setting, and then use that syntax and assign it to this particular view. Now, we haven't covered yet in Plugin 101, but we're going to in an upcoming lesson on the channel here, how to programmatically work with these settings objects. Although we have previously discussed just in videos on the channel in general how the whole preferences system in Sublime Text works. So What we're just going to say here is that this get art method in the settings object gets the value of a particular setting. And the second argument there is what the value of the setting should be considered to be if it doesn't exist. So what we're saying here is, hey, view, what is the value of your default syntax setting? And if it's not set, say it's plain text, which is what the default syntax actually is, and then assign that. So if the setting isn't set, this event listener essentially does what Sublime would normally do. All you have to do is set this setting to the name of a syntax that you want to use as a default, and that will become the new default setting. And you can find that by looking in the command palette, use the view command, view package file command. You can also go into the console and ask the view for the value of its syntax setting when the current tab is a file of a particular type. So this is a Python file that is packages python python.sublime syntax. So if we jump over to this readily available preferences.sublime settings file, this is my user preferences. All we have to do is uncomment this line to add that particular setting with that, and now the default file type will be plain text file. So if I was to comment this out and create a new file, it is plain text, exactly as we might expect it to be. That was the default. But if I was to put this setting back in play, when I create a new file, it is now a Python file. We can do whatever we like inside of this, save it to disk, and so on. So this is a very easy change to make. Now, remember, if you haven't watched the video on settings and how they work and how the different settings apply, you might want to watch that because we set that setting in the preferences setting. That means it applies to every view automatically as soon as the file is saved. But if you were using projects on Sublime Text, you could add a settings key to your Sublime project file. The value of that setting would take precedence over the one in the default user preferences. And as a result of that, inside of a project, you could have a default that's different than the global. So if you had a web project where you primarily want to work on web pages, you could create a Sublime project file, wrapping that particular project, set the setting to be HTML inside of that one. And in that project, new files are HTML by default. Or if you have another project that's writing documentation, you could have Markdown as the default, and so on. So this is a very powerful concept indeed. Moving on to the second example here, we're going to go ahead and jump that one to the top. In the same way that the default file type is plain text, the default layout in a window for when you create a new one in Sublime Text is a single column in filling the entire window. Just one file is currently visible. And what if, like me, you prefer a two-column layout, or maybe you like two rows, or the 2x2 columns and rows, or one column and the second column has two rows in it. There are commands in the menu that actually set that particular layout, but maybe it's a drag to trigger that every time you create a new window. Is it possible for us to do that, to change that default? Not in Core Sublime, but with a very simple event listener, we can. So here we have the new window layout listener, which again is an event listener. And the reason for that is we're using the on post window event here. And this particular event raises every time a window command has just finished executing. And views can't execute window commands, only Windows can execute window commands. So this event won't raise in the view event listener. So again, we need to use event listener for this one. Now, when this event raises, we get told the window that executed the command, what the command actually was, and what arguments that command got. So what we do here is say, if the command is new window, then the user just triggered the new window command. So what we want to do first is get the active window, because the window as we were provided it is the one that executed the command. So the current window is the current window that executed the command, but the active window is the one that was actually created. It will automatically be given the focus whenever it's created. So we gather the active window and we tell it to run the set layout command, which in this particular case is setting the layout to be two columns. And then we focus the group 0, which is the leftmost column, because this command leaves the focus in the rightmost column after it's executed. And if you're unsure of how I came up with set layout, well, this is a very simple thing. All you have to do is turn on command logging in the console, then use the menu item to set the layout that you like and see what command it executed, and that'll tell you that it's the set layout command, and it'll even give you the actual layout. You can also use origami to set any layout you like and then get the layout that way if you like. And I'll link to that video that tells you how to do that down in the description of the video if you're unaware. But now when we create a new window, it has the 2-column layout, the same as the settings window does or the key bindings window. So if you like that sort of thing, you can have that set as the default. And of course, this is a very simple example, but this is also something that you could do with a configuration as well if you wanted to have something different set in that particular case. Moving on down to this next example here. This is our first example of a view event listener. And the other example that we're going to cover in today's lesson is also a view event listener as well. Now remember, view event listeners are created one instance to every view to which they apply. And how does Sublime know it applies? View event listeners have an isApplicable method. It's a class method that Sublime will call every time the settings in a view change. And once the settings change, this method is invoked to ask us, do you apply to a view that has these settings? And you can return true or you can return false. The default implementation of this is to always return true. So if you create a view event listener and you don't include this, one will just be automatically created for every view as it's created. Otherwise, this will get invoked. Now, the magic of this is if the setting doesn't apply, no instance is created. If the setting is added, then this gets called it does apply. A new instance will be created right away as soon as the setting is applied. If the setting ever gets changed again, this gets called again when the settings change. If the setting is no longer set and there was an instance before, we used to apply, now we don't, the instance is created. So one nice thing about this is it allows you to turn event listeners on and off if you like. The instance itself will be completely destroyed whenever it doesn't apply. It'll only be created when it actually does apply. So that makes sure that you're not executing code that you didn't intend to if it's not actually needed right now. And it also makes it easier if you're using some events. If you had multiple events that you were triggering that all rely on a certain thing, well, if you add that to is applicable or is applicable, depending on how you like to pronounce that, then you don't have to include that in every event that appears inside. Whereas in an event listener, that's going to trigger for every event in every viewer, every window, every time, always, and you need to do perhaps more filtering to get that going. Now we're using here the on modified async because the example that we have here is something that counts the words that exist inside of a current view, and then it displays them in the status bar at the bottom. And this is an example of something that does this, but you would want to have a little bit more work going on behind the scenes than this simple example. But this shows just how simple this actually is. Now the on modified async event is an event that gets triggered every time a modification is made to the buffer, but in the asynchronous thread, not in the main thread, and see the previous lesson for why that's important. And what we have here is basically a very simple debounce because this event triggers literally for every modification. So if you type the word this, that's 4 modifications. And that means this event gets triggered 4 times in quick succession. We don't want to count the words every time you type every character. You want to wait a little bit. So what we have here is a very simple debounce mechanism. The set timeout async function basically tells Sublime to please call this function 1 second from now. If you're a web developer, this is probably very familiar because JavaScript has this exact same functionality. Set timeout async gets this to run in the async thread instead of the main thread, which is a little teaser to something we covered in the previous lesson as well. And we have this pending value that is incremented every time the event is raised and decremented every time update word count is handled. And we only do something when the value of that is 0. So the net result of all of that is the last parts of update word count only trigger 1 second after the last modification was made. So if you're busy doing a lot of typing, the word count doesn't update, all this extra work isn't happening until you stop typing for a second. And very simplistically, all we're doing is asking the view to find all instances of the regular expression of a word. And then we use the set status method to set that as a status item down in the bottom of the window there. Now, self.view is always going to be the view to which this particular event listener actually applies. So all we have to do is apply this show word count setting that we're using in is applicable here. An instance of this class will instantly be created. It'll start tracking every time we make updates. It'll update the status bar. If we don't want this anymore, we set that setting to false or remove the setting, and the result of that will be it stops tracking. Now, how do we actually set that particular setting? Well, one way to do that would be to create your own custom command that toggles the setting and maybe does a little bit more setup, which is what I would recommend for this, for reasons we'll see in just a second. But the default command toggle setting is something that we've covered in a previous video, I'm pretty sure. It takes any setting that you like and toggles its value between true and false in whatever the currently active view is. So Control-Alt-W is going to toggle the value of the show word count setting for any view that we would like to do it inside of. This is a very simple way to set this sort of thing up. So if we came back to this file, if I was to press Control-Alt-W, it has toggled the setting. So all we have to do is make a modification and the word count will appear down on the bottom of the buffer, like so. And now the word count in this is 316. And if I take that out, the word count is 315. So it's definitely working, and it has that 1 second delay. Now, one particular problem with this, I'm going to turn that off now. When I turn it off, the status bar doesn't actually get modified. The word count remains. And similarly, when you turn this on, the word count doesn't appear down in there either. You have to make a modification first. So a more complete example of this would have a custom command toggling the setting and then also updating the status bar to make it a more instantaneous. But this is a very easy to do thing, just as we have it here. Now, going to our last example, we're going to jump this one up to the top as well. Now, this is another example of a view event listener that's also using the on modified async item. And this is showcasing another reason why you might want to use a view event listener instead of an event listener. And that is taking advantage of the idea that one instance of this is created for every view to which it applies. One of the reasons you might want to do that, as we just saw, is it allows you to reduce the amount of filtering you have to do on a per event basis, and you can turn events on and off by having the instance destroy if the setting is not actually set, if the thing doesn't actually apply. But also because there's one instance created for every view, if your events require any state that you want to persist on a per view basis, this is a very easy way to do this. So this particular example would also work as a regular event listener if you wanted to do it that way, but it would be a little bit more work to do it. Now let's just go ahead through this, and we can go through this very quickly now because a lot of this is very similar to what we saw in the previous example. Our is applicable method here, or is applicable, I can never tell which way to say that, is testing that Python appears inside of the syntax setting. So this only applies to Python files. It never applies to any other type of file. And the onModified async is using the exact same debounce that we saw just previously. This is something that you see fairly often, I think, with varying levels of timeout, which incidentally could be configured, by the way, if you wanted to really make this cool, just to make sure that it doesn't trigger too frequently. But the lines 80 and 81 here are actually searching the buffer for everything that appears to be a function, and then we gather all of them as a set to make sure that if the same function name appears more than once, it only appears once in the list. And we store it into that instance variable self.functions, which is a set which defaults to being an empty set, but is updated every time we modify the file. Then we have our on query completions. That's something we have also covered in a prior lesson. It gets told not the view that the autocomplete panel is about to appear inside of, because that's going to be the view to which this view event listener applies. But we do get told the text that appears to the left of the cursor and all of the cursor locations. And we're ignoring both of those and just returning a simple list of completions, which is the name of the function. Now, if we look at this, we're returning the multi-item list version of this. The first string here is the combination trigger text and the tip that gets appeared on the right, the annotation that describes what the completion actually is, which here is the name of the function and then the text function, so that you know that this is a function. And the second item is the text that actually gets inserted when this completion is expanded, which is the name of the function and then parentheses with the $0, meaning that this is a snippet that the cursor is going to land up inside of the brackets here. Now, again, this is an example of something that's a very crude example, just showcasing how this information can easily be stored on a per view basis inside of these instance variables. Because you could do this in an event listener, but then you need a global data structure that can key this information and store it on a per view basis to know. And then you have to make sure you update that. So it is possible, and but perhaps this is a little bit easier a way to do that. So if we were to come on down here, because we have modified this, if we to start typing some code, now we have to make a modification. Now when we trigger it again, we can see that is applicable is there, and it is a type function. And when I expand it, we have the brackets and the cursor is inside of it. So that is just that easy how we can pull something like that off if we want to inside of our function here. Now, or our event listener rather. And again, this is something that you'd want to do a little bit more work with because this is kind of crude, but it does show a very good example of why you might want to store some sort of state per view and how easy that actually is. Now, we saw here 4 examples of different event listeners. This really just scratches the surface of the power of this because, as we've seen, it doesn't take a lot of code to come up with some pretty powerful changes. Now, when it comes to using event listener versus view event listener, anything you can do in an event view event listener can be done in an event listener, but the inverse is not true. Some events just do not apply and will not be raised in a view event listener. So that might inform your decision. You might also use a view event listener if you want to store any per view state inside of the event listener itself, because one instance will be created for every view to which it applies, and that makes sure that you have storage that will automatically be managed for you versus having to do that manually yourself. And if you have one or more events inside of your event listener, which isn't something that we saw here, but it is fairly common for you to have multiple events in your listener at once, if they all have the same criteria for whether or not they actually apply, using a view event listener, if the events that you want are available in it, is a good way to do that because it makes sure that you only need to put that code in one place, and that is applicable or is applicable method, and not inside of every event. You can really target things down that way. And of course, as we've seen, you can use this to turn event listeners on and off. So hopefully you've found this informative and it's a little clearer now why you would want to use something like this. Let me know down in the comment section below what you think of this. Do we need to see more examples of this? What examples would you like to see? And while you're down there, use those buttons to thumb, subscribe, and share, and ring the bell notification icon so when the next lesson becomes available, you will be notified of it right away. And until that happens, this is ODAT Nerd asking you to please have a sublime day.